At various times in the history of the church, the Christian community has had to be called back to the fundamentals of why it exists. Often what we've done is we've started to focus on just one thing. We kind of call this, let's call it the tyranny of one idea, that something starts to kind of overtake everything else. And sometimes that's been salvation. And the church has said the only thing we exist to do is give people a ticket through to heaven when they die, and everything else is kind of just trimmings. It's just kind of extra, it's add-on. And then at other times, more recently, the church has gone the other direction and said, actually, maybe it's not about salvation at all. Maybe it's about social justice. Maybe what the church is called to do is actually to care for the poor and to make a difference in the world. And all of those things are incredibly important and fundamentally true to what it means to be the church. The problem is that when one idea takes over all the rest of them, the church has to be brought back to the fundamentals of why it actually exists. And in those moments in church history when that's happened, there has always been one figure, one person who's arisen amongst the ranks of everybody else, who's willing to stand up where others just stand by, who's willing to say, actually, I need to remind the Christian community that our primary calling in the world is to tell the world that there is a God that loves them without condition. That whatever else we focus on, whether it's salvation, going to heaven when you die, whether it's social justice, helping the poor in various parts of the world, all of it fundamentally is about one thing. It's about sharing the good news of a God who came and died and rose because he loves without condition. And 500 years ago this month exactly, on October 31st actually, marks one of those moments in church history. And it started in the heart of one man. And so this series is about this idea of where every great change begins. This is a series and a conversation about what happens when we take a step back as Christians. And we dare to look at the church maybe for a moment from the outside and to do a little bit of a dissection of where we're at as a Christian community and to ask, what does it mean to be people of grace in our time? Not people of grace in our parents' time or people of grace in our grandparents' time. What does it mean to ask afresh, what does it mean to be Christians here in our time? So if this is your first time with us, we like to launch into messages here in a conversational way. We recognize that the Christian life isn't about information, it's about transformation. And that's a relational concept. It's something that can't be done one-dimensionally with some guy standing at the front and telling you how to change your life. It's something that happens around tables and in conversation. So we want to start all our messages with a question. I'm going to give you guys 5 or 6 minutes to wrestle through this. It says this: what words characterize the way that people outside the church view Christians? And depending on how well you know people on your table, you can either be really generous or you can be really honest. Let's just see which way it goes. I don't really know. But here's the question. What words characterize the way people outside the church view Christians in the contemporary world? So I'm going to give you guys 5 or 6 minutes to wrestle through that, and then we'll be right back. Okay, guys, let's go on a little journey together. I want you to imagine that you came into church tonight. You don't have to imagine that, you did, obviously. Unless you're listening on the podcast, in which case, where are you? But let's imagine that you came into church tonight, and you walked down our very precarious little ramp, but you didn't go to the coffee bar. There's no espresso machine. You didn't come and talk to your friends. You didn't debrief your week a little bit. You didn't come and sit down. You walked in a solemn silence, and you moved towards the front, and then you knelt at a wooden pew. Okay, and then no worship band got up. Instead, what happened was a choir got up, which can be a beautiful thing. But you hoped that maybe the choir would sing one of these songs that you know. Instead, they sang in a language that you don't understand, an archaic, ancient language that only the educated and the elite understand. And then a priest got up, but he wasn't cool and fashionable. Right. I wore my coolest sweater today, which in itself is probably an ironic thing to say. The priest got up, but he wasn't cool and hip like me. No, the priest got up and he opened a Bible, dusty old Bible, and he starts reading in the same language that the choir is singing in. It's a language called Latin, and none of you understand it because it's the language of the educated and the elite. And then he tells you in your own language, you need to be saved. If you're at church here tonight, then it means that you need to be saved of your sins. And I can do that for you, but it's going to cost you $500. It's going to cost you $500 of your hard-earned or not so hard-earned cash to be saved and to save your soul from hell. Now, you might think to hear that I'm talking about ancient Israel, that maybe I'm talking about the Old Testament, a time before Jesus Christ. But actually, 500 years ago, that was exactly what the church was like. 500 years ago, this thing that we do here on a Sunday night was that. So my question is this: what would you believe about God if that was your experience of church? What would you think about this God that we claim to know and to have access to and to be able to communicate with and feel in our hearts and see in the expression of our lives if that was your experience of church? Maybe you'd think that this God is actually deeply inaccessible. Maybe this God is unreachable. Maybe you'd think, actually, this God is not a God for me. He's a God for the educated and the elite, the people who are the best and the brightest in society. Maybe you'd think that a relationship with God is predicated on your worthiness, not on his grace. And 500 years ago this month, this thing we do on a Sunday night that we call church was that. And this question of ours, what would you think of God if that was your experience of church? This question, above everybody else, troubled the conscience of one man, an obscure German professor, who found himself asking, what story does that kind of a church tell about the God that we know? And his name was Martin Luther. Martin Luther looked around him and saw the corruption of the church that was selling salvation for the highest bid. And on October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther decided to do something about it. He wrote a letter denouncing the practices of this corrupt Catholic Church. And on a very dramatic, stormy night in Wittenberg, Germany, Martin Luther left his office and walked through town and went straight to the church. And he took his letter about the corruption of the church and he nailed it into the door of the church in Wittenberg. And you saw a little glimpse of it there in the video. This guy who's hammering his theses into the door of the church. And that little moment, that to us might seem small, arbitrary, just a grumpy old man who seems to have problems with the church as it exists, that little moment began a movement that would turn the church back to its true calling, and ultimately that would go on to change the world. Because Luther said, actually, if the gospel isn't predicated on your worth, but it's predicated on God's grace, then it means everybody has equal access to God, doesn't it? It means that access to God is not just the privilege of priests and the educated and the elite. Luther looked around him and he said, the way we do church doesn't tell the story of that kind of God. And so the answer was, we have to change the way that we do church. And so what Luther did was absolutely astounding and radical in its time. The first thing he did was he took the Bible, written in Latin, which was kind of the sacred language of the 16th century, and he started translating it into German, which to us might not seem like very much. Actually, that was a radical thing. It was one of the first times that anybody had translated the Bible into the common tongue of uneducated people. And then my favorite thing that Martin Luther did was he said, look, the problem is when people come into church, they want to worship the Lord. But the songs are sung in a language and a style that they don't understand, that they can't engage with. And so Martin Luther looked around and said, what kind of songs does everybody know? How can we start to translate these hymns into a style that people will understand? And Martin Luther said, well, the most popular songs around here are the ones we sing in pubs. So he took these songs that drunk Germans would sing in pubs, and he said, let's populate those songs and the style of that music with Christian content. Let's take this tired, archaic Latin hymnology and let's translate it into the tongue and style of the people. And by the way, some of those hymns we still have. So the hymns that we love, Be Thou My Vision, How Great Thou Art, those songs originally were in the style of pub songs. If you went back 500 years and sang those songs, they wouldn't understand the words, but they would sing along with you. It would probably just be filled with more swear words and be about like old ale and stuff. Now, Martin Luther did all these radical things, and before long, he was pulled before the Pope himself. Not only the Pope, he was pulled before the Emperor of Rome. The entire Western world controlled by the clutch of this one man. And Martin Luther, this obscure German professor, found himself pulled before it, and he was invited to recant his position. They said, you cannot go against the church as it exists now. This is the way we do things. And Martin Luther's response was in words that came to echo through history, some of the most famous words ever uttered by a Christian leader. He said, here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God. Martin Luther said, this gospel of grace is worth my life. And so he was labeled a heretic. Now, that might not sound like very much to us. That's pretty much the worst charge you can get in the 16th century. It meant that Luther had to run for his life. He went and hid in a castle somewhere. It's all very Disney, the whole thing. It really is. He went and hid in a castle in Germany, and nobody found him for a long time. And he continued to put out letters and songs and content about this God of grace that people had long since forgotten about. And that moment that seems so small to us actually reshaped the direction of church and the direction of all of human history. Now, why is this relevant? This might seem like ancient history to you and me. It's relevant because of this. Dietrich Bonhoeffer put it better than I can. He said this: the most urgent problem besetting the church is this: how can we live the Christian life in the modern world? How can we live the Christian life? How can we be people marked and defined by grace in the modern world? And that's a question that in various times the church has had to ask afresh. They've had to ask it anew, in a new way. How do we live and witness to a better story in our world, in our time? Have you ever noticed that often the church is 10 years behind culture? That often the church is answering questions that the world has long since stopped asking. And the church does this in really interesting ways. The church is wrestling with issues at the moment around same-sex attraction. And we have to wrestle with those problems. The difficulty is when the church starts to think that we're on the same wavelength as the world. That has long since felt it's found an answer to those questions. So how do we wrestle with that in a new way? Sometimes that's the same as our worship as well. Our songs and styles are like 10 years behind culture. I don't know if you've noticed that. That's why all our songs sound like Coldplay, even though no one really listens to Coldplay anymore. Is that true, or is that just in England? I don't know. You guys seem a little offended by that when I said that. I don't know if... Sorry, that's heresy right there. That's heresy. The question we have to ask ourselves is this. We have this gospel that disrupts the world. This gospel that transforms the world if only we let it. But the question is, how do we tell that story to the world we find ourselves in today? Every year, Time magazine puts out a little thing they call the 100 most influential people in the world. I don't know how they gather that data, or I don't know how they calculate that, but they decide we have what it takes to tell you who are the 100 most influential people in the world this year. And by 2012, they decided this has gone a little stale, a little old, so they decided to up the ante. And they put out the 100 most influential people in human history. Now, if I had to ask you to guess who came in at around number one, who took the gold for the most influential person in human history, anyone care to guess? Someone whispered Jesus. I heard you. You all thought Jesus, let's be honest. Because we're in church, so you think that has to be the right answer? It's like, I don't know if that's real or not, but that's got to be the right answer. It's interesting. Jesus didn't take first place, okay? Jesus didn't even take the silver medal. Jesus came in, and frankly, an embarrassing number 3 on the most influential people in human history. And this created a little bit of hubbub with not only Christians, but historians who looked around and they said, how can you possibly not think that Jesus is the most influential person ever? Not only because there's 2 billion Christians in the world now, and many, many more than that in human history, but because the entire Western world, nay, the entire world itself, has been shaped by this man that we call Jesus. The answer was really, really interesting. Time magazine responded, they said this. They said, if those 2 billion Christians in the world actually lived by Jesus' example, and actually lived by Jesus' teaching, then Jesus would take number 1 spot by a wide margin. If Christians actually lived as if what Jesus said was true, then he would be easily the most influential person in human history. Now, I'm not here to say that people outside the church have any place in telling Christians how they're supposed to live. That's a very contentious issue, but it raises a really interesting point. That somehow the world has an idea of what it means to follow Jesus. And somehow that idea, they use that as a measuring stick against Christians, and they say, actually, Christians come up short. Think back on the discussion question just a few moments ago. What are some of the words that came up? I'm guessing one of the words that might have come up when you were talking about how the world views Christians is hypocritical. Did anybody hear the word hypocritical come up on their table? Tell me they did, otherwise I'm gonna lose you for the rest. Okay, almost everybody had it come up on their table. Hypocritical, what an interesting word. There was a study put out a few years ago by the Barna Group, who do a lot of religious sociological work in North America. And one of the top words they found that people use to describe Christians, I think it was number one, was hypocritical. Now, let's really dissect that. That's really interesting. Hypocritical is an interesting word. People didn't say Christians are greedy. They didn't say Christians are proud. They didn't say Christians are angry and they honk their horn at us, but they shouldn't do that because they're Christians. No, they say Christians are hypocritical, which is to say this. People have a standard for what they expect of people who follow Jesus, and somehow that standard is different than the standard for everybody else. Ask yourself this for a second. Where did they get that idea? Have you ever heard anyone say, I really like Jesus, I just don't like Christians? Have you ever heard anyone say that? I have friends who say it to me all the time. I invite them to church and they say, yeah, I'd go to church because I love Jesus. I love that guy. He's the best. In fact, I pray to him and I believe in him. I just hate Christians, so I can't be a Christian because I don't want to identify myself with those people. It tells you something really interesting, that the cultural distaste that people have for Christianity has nothing to do with the content of our gospel. Have you ever heard someone say, that Jesus guy, he's kind of a loser. I don't like him. I don't like what he stood for. I don't like what he taught. I don't like how he lived his life. I don't like how he loved people. I've never heard anybody say that. Do you know what I mean? But people say all the time, I love your Jesus, I just hate your Christians. I've never heard somebody say, I'm not a Christian because I don't like the idea of a God who loves me no matter what I do. I've never heard anybody say that. Maybe you have, and if you have, tell me, because that'd make my day. That'd be great. But I've never heard anybody say that. But I've heard plenty of people say, Christians don't love me. Christians don't accept me. Christians don't live as if it's true that God loves me without condition. Like the church in Luther's day, maybe sometimes the church is prone to say, actually, this life of ours is only for some people. Maybe nowadays it's not the educated and the elite. Maybe nowadays people look at the church and they say, that's only for Christians. Because at various times in the church's history, we've forgotten it. And we've gotten it wrong, and we've gotten off track. And at various times, we've needed people to pull us back on course. Jesus for the people of Israel. Paul for the early church. Martin Luther for the Catholic Church in the 16th century. See, Luther in his time asked, how do we need to live in a way that tells the world the story of a God that loves them without condition? And as time clearly think is important, that is also a question that Christians need to wrestle with in our own time. So why don't we? Why do people look at Christians and say, fundamentally, one of the most definitive things about you is that you don't actually live as if it's true that people are loved without condition by God? Well, I think the problem is this. We don't want to rock the boat. It's very hard for us to question what's always been around, to question the way things are, to question the status quo. Because when we start to translate the gospel to an emerging world, when we start to dare to say we need to rethink how we live this story as if it's true, when we start to ask questions afresh of how we witness to the grace of God in a world that has changed, it upsets religious sensibilities. It doesn't upset non-Christians. It upsets people who like things the way they are in the church. Now, here's my encouragement for tonight, and here's where we get into a little bit of scripture. If you struggle with that kind of an idea, that it's difficult to shake things up because you don't want to upset religious sensibilities, then you need to find yourself in a different company, and that's the company of Jesus. Because Jesus recognized that this gospel of grace is always good news to the lost and the left behind. It's always something that's invitational and attractive and maybe even irresistible. But it's a difficult pill to swallow for those who like things the way they are. Let's read this story together in Luke 7. It's one of my favorite stories in the New Testament. It gives a little picture of what we're talking about. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and he reclined at the table. A woman in that town who was a sinner learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. Now, let's stop there for a second. Notice the contrast in the story. Luke's doing something really intentional. He's saying there's two people in this. Well, there's three. There's Jesus as well. But there's two primary characters in this story. There's a Pharisee. There's somebody who has it right. Somebody who has a lot to earn from a gospel that is built around merit. around you working hard to please God. And then there's somebody else, somebody who doesn't even have a name in the story. They're just a sinner. They're just someone whose mistakes and bad decisions have come to define their whole life. They're a sinner. And Luke draws this comparison. And he says this: as the sinner stood behind Jesus at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who's touching him, what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You've judged correctly, Jesus said. And he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You didn't give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You didn't give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered hasn't stopped kissing my feet. You didn't put oil on my head, but she's poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, for she loved much. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. And Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. The other guests began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. So the story gives us one of these amazing contrasts that Jesus is always giving us to try to tell us something that's very hard for us to miss. It gives us the contrast of a Pharisee and a prostitute. Notice that the prostitute, the sinner, never gets a name. We find out the Pharisee's name. He's Simon. The prostitute never gets a name. She's defined entirely by her sin, by her inability to access the holy living God. So Luke gives us a Pharisee and a prostitute. Or let's say it this way. He gives us a saint and a sinner. And the line that divides them is the gospel of forgiveness. Let's ask this question. Why is Jesus so inviting to sinners? Why in the Gospels is Jesus so compelling and irresistible to people who are trapped in a life of sin and brokenness? And on the flip side of that, why is Jesus so offensive to saints? Like really, this is something that's so cliche. We know it so well that it doesn't startle us anymore. Ask it this way. Why is the person who models ultimate holiness not unreachable to sinners? The person who is God himself in flesh, why isn't he inaccessible? Why isn't he unreachable? Why isn't he untouchable? And why on the other side is this man who represents God himself, the goal of all religion, totally offensive to the religious sensibilities of those around him? It's because grace has always offended religious sensibilities. There's something about grace that is an offense to those who have something to gain from a religion that's built on merit. When you build a religion on credit, the credit that you can accrue with God, when something comes along and says, actually, it's not about that, actually, everybody has the same free access to God, you have a lot to lose from that. A lot to lose from that kind of a message and gospel and lifestyle. When you've built your life around earning favor, earning the favor of God, it becomes very difficult to swallow the pill of a gospel who welcomes all without condition. And so when Martin Luther comes along 500 years ago this month, and he says, actually, it isn't about merit. It isn't about one kind of access for the common folk, the sinners, and a different kind of access for the elite and educated and the religious. He's a heretic. When Luther comes along and preaches a gospel of free forgiveness for everybody, he has to run for his life. Why? Not because the sinners are after him, because the religious sensibilities of the priests are offended by him. And when Jesus comes along and he goes directly to a sinner and he says, I forgive you in the same way that I forgive this Pharisee, that the grace that you receive is the same grace and it has the same outcome despite yourself, despite your behavior and brokenness and character and choices, he's put on a cross for it. He's called a heretic for it. You see, as Christians, if we live as if God's grace is actually true, as if God's grace is not just a religious platitude that is really nice to talk about and sing about and pray about in quiet times, in waves, coffee, I don't know. If it's actually true, if it actually reshapes and redefines everything about us, when we live like that as Christians, we have to be willing to offend somebody. When you live the kind of life that tells the story of a God of grace, it looks like a life of radical hospitality. It means you're going to have religious sensibilities colliding with people who don't know how they ever found themselves in church. It means you're going to host people at your home that you outright don't like. My wife and I have a practice that I just hate, where about 2 years ago we said we're not having enough people around for dinner. And the real problem was that we only had our friends around for dinner, which is probably like most of us here. This isn't a guilt trip, but I noticed that that was a problem for us. And so we came up with this different system, that now we have a rotating format of the kinds of people we have round. We have family round first, and then the next week we'll have a friend round, and then we'll have someone we call a first-timer, someone we know a little bit but we've never had for dinner before. And then this is the reason I hate it. The fourth week we'll have someone we call a foe, someone we just don't like and don't really want to hang out with. And if you've been to my house, you're wondering which one of those you are. I'm not going to tell you. So the reality is that that is what it looks like to live a life that's marked by grace. It means living differently. Why? Because the grace of God accepts all without condition. Being a Christian that lives as if grace is actually true means loving people not because of who they are, but because of what you believe about the way the world is. Because you believe that God has saved everybody, that God's grace is an open door for everybody. And so you have no opportunity and no right or no reason to not love everybody extravagantly. Living as if grace is true means spending time with the kinds of people who are lost and left behind by a world like ours that is driven by merit. Our world is driven by what you can bring to the table. And if you can't bring anything to the table, then the table is not open for you. And living as if grace is true means being a radical protest to that kind of a world. And when you do that, when you live in those kinds of ways, you might offend those who have a share in the world as it is. Those who have an interest, maybe even in church, the way it is. People who want to protect what we have. But it will be an irresistible witness to those who are looking for a better story. First Peter says it this way, and with this I kind of come into land. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God. Let's put it this way. Live such good lives among the pagans that even though they say you're a hypocrite, even though they say Christians don't live to the standard that they're supposed to live to, even though they say because of that, Jesus is not the most influential person in human history, but you live in such a way that they still look at you and say, there's something different. Live a life that takes Jesus seriously. Live as if God's grace is not about your behavior and not about how holy you can be. Actually, that it's a grace without condition, because that kind of a life is irresistible to people who need grace. So as I close, let me give you a litmus test for your Christian life. Okay? Are you ready to bring it home? Because this is painful. This is about to be painful. You're not ready. I'll just do it anyway. Here's a litmus test for how well you understand this, or at least are trying to practice and express it. If you are constantly offending those outside the church, if you are constantly butting heads with atheists and people who don't know Jesus, then you need to check yourself. If you're constantly disagreeing and arguing in a vitriolic way, if you're fighting for your side and saying, you don't get us, Christians aren't hypocrites, you're the hypocrite, you suck, I'm rubber, you're glue, whatever, I can't remember which way around it is. I think that's the right way. Yeah, that must be right. Otherwise, yeah, that's right. If you're constantly running into people who don't call themselves Christians, you need to check yourself. And here's the flip side. This is where it gets a little painful. If you're not willing to offend religious sensibilities, if you're not willing to go against the religious grain, if you're not willing to ever ask the questions of why we do certain things, then you might be living a tamed gospel. You might be living a half gospel, a watered down gospel. Because being a Christian, living as if grace is actually a true story, and not just one true story amongst other true stories, as if grace is the true story, not just of us, but of everyone who's ever lived and ever will live. If grace is the defining story that makes sense of their lives, and you live as if that's true, you have to be willing to be called a heretic on occasion. You have to be willing to have people misunderstand you, to have people say, that person's different. That person's willing to offend. And this is so hard for us, because as Christians, the last thing we want is to offend anybody. But this is what it means to be a Jesus follower. As we close, this is why we need Martin Luther's. This is why we need people who are willing to be called a heretic. Because where other people stand by and just let status quo slide and continue on, heretics hold to the gospel. They say, here I stand. I stand on the side of a story about a God of grace, a God who accepts everybody without condition, and I can do no other. So help me God.